It exaggerates and exacerbates racism and women's inequality.
Você acha que hoje Cuba tem uma relação já resolvida com relação ao racismo? Você acha que hoje Cuba poderia ser um exemplo de uma sociedade igualitária?
Well, of course, racism is very complex, and I would never assume to suggest that anywhere in the world the problem of racism has been solved. In the U.S., the assumption is that racism was dismantled with the triumph of the civil rights movement. Here in Brazil, there has been talk about racial democracy for who knows how long, but we understand that racism continues to affect the social, economic, and political structures. In Cuba, Cuba has gone a long way toward disestablishing those structural inequalities that are brought about by racism. That is to say, in terms of jobs, in terms of housing, in terms of health care, in terms of access to the university. Cuba has gone a long way, but I'm sure there are many, many more challenges there. But I do think that we can be inspired by those efforts to eradicate structural racism, because unfortunately, most people assume that racism is about individual utterances, individual attitudes. People get very upset about the use of certain words that are racist, but they don't get upset about the fact that a disproportionate number of black people are behind bars and a disproportionate number of black people on the other side have access to the university. So race really matters when it comes to determining who gets to get an education and who gets to spend their lives behind bars.
Nós ouvimos a ministra da Secretaria de Políticas de Promoção da Igualdade Social, Luísa Barros. Ela nos enviou uma pergunta, vamos ouvir.
Ângela, desde que nós nos encontramos pela primeira vez no final dos anos 90, você tem vindo ao Brasil mais ou menos regularmente, já nos encontramos outras vezes em atividades na Bahia, onde existe uma relação bastante forte sua com vários grupos de combate ao racismo. Ao longo desse tempo, o que você identifica como sendo as principais mudanças na política racial brasileira?
Well, of course, I have been fortunate enough to have spent some time in Brazil over the last decade and a half. And what I've been most impressed by has been the impact of affirmative action. In the U.S., of course, affirmative action has been under attack for the last 2 decades. And if one looks at some of the major public universities in the state where I live, the state of California, the percentage of black students has declined over the last period. On the other hand, here in Brazil, I've watched the creation of a new university in Bahia, and I participated a year and a half ago, I believe, in Black Solidarity Day in Reconcagua and in the campus in Cruz das Almas. And I was totally impressed by the fact that 80% of the students are of African descent there. I wish the U.S. could embrace a strategy that allows us to move so rapidly. But of course, as I was saying before, racism is very complex and many changes remain to be made.
Voltando pouco, uma pessoa que foi durante 20 anos membro do Partido Comunista e que foi uma coisa importante na vida de muitas gerações, a senhora lamentou o fim do comunismo? Lamentou a derrocada da União Soviética, da Alemanha? Como é que a senhora acompanhou esse processo?
Yes, it was a sad occasion to see the dismantling of socialism in the countries in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union. Although we understand that there were major problems that existing socialism had not solved. Perhaps there were major inroads with respect to economic democracy, but political democracy had not been created. And therefore, the lessons were not that socialism is no longer a valid aspiration, but that we must be as attentive to other modes of democracy as we are to economic democracy. And as a matter of fact, I was a member of the Communist Party at that time, and we took that, some of us took that, as a sign that we needed to try to democratize the internal structure of the Communist Party. Unfortunately, it didn't happen at that time, and many of us left the Communist Party and created another organization that is called Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. But I continue to do work with the Communist Party of the U.S. today. We have very cordial relations because I think that people have recognized that we need to take seriously the problematic aspects of existing socialism at that time without assuming that it is all right to declare the triumph of capitalism and to toss aspirations for socialism into the garbage can. I'm still as much a communist now as I was then, I think.
Você falava sobre os símbolos da persistência desse racismo estrutural presentes na sociedade norte-americana. Você considera que a pena de morte, por exemplo, é um desses símbolos persistentes? Como e quais as outras demonstrações do racismo estruturando a sociedade norte-americana hoje?
I could talk about many examples. I could talk about the healthcare system and the privatization of healthcare and the impact, the disproportionate impact this has had on Black communities, Latino communities, and other communities of color. But as you pointed out, the persistence of capital punishment is perhaps the most dramatic example of the way in which the inheritances of slavery continue to plague the U.S. 150 years after the putative abolition of slavery. As I've often pointed out, there was discussion about the need to abolish the death penalty around the time of the American Revolution. We're talking about the end of the 1700s. And in most places, it was abolished except for murder, for white people. But it was retained as a punishment for slaves. And this is why the institution itself survived and moved into the mainstream in the aftermath of the abolition of slavery. And so when one wonders why, of all the industrialized democracies in the world, the U.S. is the only country that uses capital punishment as a routine mode of punishment, the only answer is racism, the inheritances of slavery. And now, of course, the debates are about humane modes of death. Is it better to kill someone with this chemical or that chemical? And of course, that is absolutely ridiculous.
Você poderia esclarecer o nosso público, porque de vez em quando a gente vê que um homem branco também vai para a pena de morte. Então a ideia de que é uma coisa contra, que é uma herança da escravidão, muitas vezes fica complicada por causa disso. Se você explicasse um pouco a diferença, os tratamentos, por que a gente pode achar que é uma continuidade, né, que a necessidade de abolir isso tem a ver com a escravidão, a importância, o número de negros que são muito mais condenados, um pouco a dificuldade que eles têm de acesso a uma defesa justa, como é que seria isso assim?
First of all, white people can also be victims of racism. And so when I talk about the death penalty, capital punishment, as a racist apparatus. I'm not only talking about the people, the bodies of the people whom it affects. I'm talking about the structure itself. So when a white person is put to death, that person is just as much a victim of a racist machine
okay.
as a black person. So I think it's very important to point that out, because we're so accustomed to thinking about racism only as individual acts against individual bodies. And I think we need to talk about the structural character of racism. I was recently in South Africa, where there continues to be discussion about the miners who were killed in Marikana. Some 30 black miners were shot by black police under the direction of black women police commissioners. And the question is whether one can still say that that police apparatus is racist, even though all of the characters are black. And I think one has to talk about the inheritances of apartheid, the memories of apartheid that are still deeply embedded in that structure. And so I would say the same thing of police departments.
Nós temos isso aqui também, quer dizer, a polícia brasileira é violenta, e se você for olhar a cor da pele das pessoas, muitas vezes são policiais negros assassinando.
Aliás, eu queria
garotos negros.
Aqui no Brasil, recentemente, no ano passado, um trabalhador negro chamado Amarildo foi preso numa favela, na favela da Rocinha, tudo gravado por câmeras instaladas na própria comunidade, e desapareceu. Desapareceram com o Amarildo. E acabou ficando um símbolo da luta contra esse verdadeiro apartheid que existe na sociedade brasileira. O Amarildo é mais um dos milhares de brasileiros negros que são presos e desaparecem sem um motivo, sem uma razão, apenas por serem negros. Recentemente, a nossa equipe de TV esteve fazendo uma entrevista com a mulher do Amarildo, e os policiais, em determinado momento, chegaram próximo à viatura da TV Brasil e perguntaram para o motorista o que eles estavam fazendo ali. Aquela mulher não tinha mais nada a dizer. Ou seja, há um cerceamento até da comunicação do que se passa dentro dessa periferia. Como é que o senhor acha que a gente vai conseguir virar essa página e acabar definitivamente com essa violência contra os negros brasileiros?
I think we have to. I don't think we can assume that this will be the way of the future. And that means that each time there is such an incident where a black person is brutalized or murdered or disappeared by the police, we have to speak up. But we cannot assume that it's only about individual cases. And I think that's a problem that we face. In the U.S., and all over Europe and Brazil, we focus on the individual cases which we should. We should, of course, focus on those individual cases. But we should recognize that they happen because of the racism that's within the institution. So simply by prosecuting the one policeman who is involved in brutalizing or murdering a black person, we're not going to solve the problem of the continuation, the perpetuation of racism through police forces. So we have to change the way police forces work, just as we have to change the role of the prison. Some people think this is too idealistic, but the imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment has not always been with us. It is an invented punishment. And if it came into being in history, it can go out of being, can go out of existence in history. So I think it really is important to have what I would call an abolitionist perspective to these issues.
Bem, vamos fazer um rápido intervalo. Nós voltamos em instantes entrevistando a Angela Davis. Por ser um programa gravado, nós pedimos para que as pessoas enviassem suas perguntas antes. Não saia daí!
Brasileirão.